There's sort of these lessons that we draw from other phases of innovation in the internet. That's a common theme. There's obviously lessons we can draw from, electronic money itself, like the birth of messaging standards like Swift, the birth of card associations, like what we think of as electronic money today, whether it's sort of fractional reserve commercial bank money or central bank money, like all of these, ended up, kind of happening at scale when broad stakeholders got together to agree upon standards, to make sure that those standards and how they operate work within the law, and that governments be comfortable with them. And this is sort of, as you said, Dante, like this is the next logical stage of the international financial system. It has the potential to do a lot more and be more inclusive and more efficient and open up, programmability and all this super exciting stuff. But fundamentally, the thing that gets these things to have scale is layering and governance. I wonder, what other lessons we can learn from the growth of the internet itself, and internet standards. And, I think I remember well, when, the early stages of commercialization of the internet, and, you had regulators in every country in the world, some of whom controlled national monopolies that controlled, say, the communication system of a given country, some of which had, actual monopolies, but, fundamentally, like, there was a set of governance that emerged around technical standards that was mostly driven by computer scientists, academics, innovators, and then industry sort of said, oh, you know what, this stuff is pretty good. It's good enough. We're going to start connecting to it. And then, the technology raced way ahead of what the regulatory regimes ever had. Like, it used to be, if you wanted to like broadcast a radio show in Italy, like you needed permission from a regulator to do that. But I can do that. I can do that right this minute. I can broadcast a radio show in Italy, uncensored. And so I wonder what lessons there are to learn, and whether, is there a disconnect between what I'll just call like the community-led, open source, grassroots, movement of the internet, which is, has built all this stuff, and the expectation that governments have about, no, this stuff is stuff that we control. And how do we reconcile that? Because it seems like it worked in the world of information, knowledge, communications, content to be a little bit more open. And I wonder if it would work in the financial system as well, or if the instincts of governors to want to control this are too much at odds with that.
Part of the challenge, I think, in this space is that you kind of had the app and the technology happen at the same time. But at the same time, like, we are moving to a place where you can divorce those two things, but a lot of people don't really understand that yet. Still don't really get, that. I remember when I started at the forum, in 2018 Davos. I started 2017. In 2018 Davos, my entire soundbite was like, Bitcoin and blockchain, not the same thing. Bitcoin and blockchain, not the same thing. Like over and over and over, parroting it, right? Because people didn't understand that.
Yeah.
And so we've moved past that, but there's still a general lack of understanding of the distinction between the technical element and the financial systems element. And this is recreating something that has a tremendous amount of power and inertia behind it. Right? You're going all the way back to kind of Bretton Woods, and you think about creating a new financial order, a new financial system. The thing I think that's not, so there's a lot in there to unpack, but the thing I think that's not talked about a lot is how we thought about systemic risk. And so one thing that's really interesting, I think this is Dante's earlier point, is that we've kind of defined in the financial system systemic risk. We've just kind of like carved out a whole group of people and said, well, yes, they're very vulnerable, but they're just outside of our system. Therefore, our system is really not all that risky, or we can kind of allocate the risk in a way that kind of neutralizes a lot of it. And then this whole thing over here, we're going to ignore. And part of what I think the pandemic, at least I hope it has really highlighted, is that no system, there is no outsider to the system. You have to look at the entirety of the system, and you have to accommodate and count for that systemic risk, that risk that is coming from outside of what you think of as your closed system. So I actually think the internet early days did a very good job without necessarily making this a highlight, but thinking about that and being very open to a model that would accommodate more holistic notions of systemic risk. And that's something I don't think we talk about enough in our sector. We all think about it without maybe implicitly or otherwise. We don't really talk about it as much.
Mhm.
So I've started doing a lot more thinking about the early days of the internet and how risk was accommodated and how we could think about that in the new financial system that we're all interested in seeing be built, or in your cases, actually literally building.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Well, and the key is optionality, right? So if
agree.
as it happens, risk is my cup of tea. I serve on FEMA's National Advisory Council, lose sleep over risk every day, all the time. And when you think about it, the one area of literally the entire global economy that performed well in the middle of the pandemic that sent the entire world on a work from home excursion, those so fortunate to have the ability to work from home, and it withstood the load, right? It withstood the load of entire economies being permanently working from home, and that kind of bandwidth capability and that inherent resilience in the design. Our financial systems don't enjoy that, right? So when the federal government had to respond to this crisis with in all about $5.5 trillion of intervention to save the economy, effectively an example of privatizing gain and socializing losses, the very type of pattern we saw in 2008. It then begs very, very deep questions about whether or not things like financial inclusion are basic human rights. And simply put, whether or not ubiquitous, near universal access to the internet should be simply a part of the digital commons that we all enjoy. If we're all going to depend on it in the middle of a fire drill, which is the COVID-19 event, then we should also ensure that on those rails could ride the transfer of value, the transfer of information, the transfer of assets, the transfer of title, identity, assurance, authentication, you name it. Today, none of those things are possible at scale, and it's an indictment of us as a planet and as a modern economy. I'm speaking now of the United States, that in order to exercise your civic duty and go vote, you have to go violate social distancing requirements and wait in a physical line to exercise your civic duty. That should be something that motivates all of us, whether it's blockchain or some other standard, to make sure that the very core principles of functioning in a modern system and in a modern economy can leverage technology as a difference maker. And for all the areas that broke very rapidly with the onset of the pandemic, value, identity, voting, these types of basic civic engagements could use a little bit of digitization.
Yeah, I love your thinking there, Dante. Right on. I think. I think what's interesting is there's the sort of top-down view, like, should the national government have, in China, there's like blockchain is a major national initiative. It's got, sponsorship up and down the chain. It's, no pun intended. It's a big thing. There's nothing like that going on, in most Western countries, certainly in the United States, which I think is unfortunate, but there is a lot of bottom-up innovation happening, right? There are so many interesting engineers, startups, projects, some sponsored by big tech companies like Facebook, but lots of them that are open source, that are building the plumbing for a public infrastructure where you can do secure identity, and that, nation states could even depend on for voting. And so there is so much that is there. And I feel like the collective commons of intellectual property creation that the internet has is working. And it may not work on the speed that we want. And I think what we're seeing out of China a little bit is, leveraging that IP commons and all the energy around it with a big boost of industrial policy as well. And so I think that could be, part of the answer.
Well, and I'm sure all of us are, sorry, Sheila,
Go for it.
that's the only time, and I won't do it again, I promise. I'm sure we're
Believe
all
it when I see it.
right? We're all tracking with great interest. The way Chris Giancarlo, likens this as a digital space race, sort of an equivalent. I'm not in the vein of a zero-sum kind of person. I don't think we have to win at anybody's expense. And I think any one of these projects would benefit enormously from a very vibrant and innovative, thriving private sector. And what you see here, and this is why, again, I'm back to the great work that the Digital Currency Governance Consortium is trying to do, and the WEF is such a uniquely placed entity to build those bridges, is that you do want, and I think all of us would want, to have the public sector have oversight over monetary policy and the creation of money. If a stable coin is nothing better than if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then a good US dollar-backed stable coin is trying to mirror the underlying economic soundness and preconditions of the US dollar. But the creation of the dollar and the management of public policy and monetary sovereignty is a public sector activity. But the rails on how that type of value are delivered should and ought to include anything from a SWIFT transfer to an ACH to an EFT to an option based on blockchain and stablecoins. It's a better, more resilient system than one that is only riding on one or two cylinders from an economic value point of view. So it's not zero sum. I want you to succeed, and I want everybody else in this sector to have a chance at success. Right now, that success is being hindered by a lot of red tape, a lot of fear, and a lot of apprehension in the public sector that these types of risks or projects become systemic or they destabilize the system. And a lot of that sort of early branding problem the space had is kind of lingering with all of us. But I think there's a new era here where we can get it right and also get to innovate at scale.
This gets to the public-private dimension here, Sheila. I know that's fundamental to the web platform. Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything we do is multi-stakeholder in its conception. So it's about bringing together public and private sector actors and the third sector as well to really think about civil society actors, academics and others who are really focused, possibly more narrowly, but experts in particular needs articulated by certain communities. I think another thing we try to do is think very hard about geographic diversity. So a lot of the conversation needs to, and I know that both of you are good about this, but many are not, think about where the innovation is really happening. And that's in part where the innovation is able to happen. There is less incentive in really established economies. There's more fear, there's less, there's more incumbent power, right? So a lot of the innovation is happening in frontier economies or smaller economies, and we're learning a lot from what's happening there. So when I first started at the forum, it was really, I had to really make the case that we should be focusing not just on the sort of typical halls of power, but looking at, a lot of the island nations, the ECCB, looking at what Cambodia was doing, looking at some of the work that's happening in Africa, like all over the continent, by the way, right? Not just in Kenya, not just in what they were doing, kind of coming down in a draconian manner, or Ghana or Nigeria, but really looking across some of these economies to see what are the opportunities that we may be with a Western mindset blind to, and bringing those communities together. So our CBDC project actually started off with a goal, the only goal was community building. It was to say, we know which banks are talking to each other and which aren't. It's a huge miss. And we have the convening power and ability to say, you need to listen to these guys over here or these people over here, and do some education about what is actually possible with this technology. And in that case, it was really starting off with a focus on blockchain, but then moving into an examination more of CBDC offerings. Now, to the point about the kind of one ring to rule them all, we are fervently opposed to that view. I don't think it makes any sense. It doesn't make any sense, strictly from the standpoint, if you even thought about it, if there was one CBDC, one stablecoin, and one crypto, there'd still be three, and they have very different needs. But it just doesn't make any sense because, as you know, Dante, depending on what you kind of choose to put in your basket or what you choose to be backed by, you're basically adopting to some extent a certain set of values, and I think that we have to be very mindful of what those values are, not just from a literal economic power, really from a signaling perspective as well. I think that's also really important. And so while I agree with you, that it's really important to think about stability, particularly in the environment that we're in now more than maybe ever, as we're getting economic fissures and challenges that we haven't really seen before, well, at least, in our lifetime. I think that it's really important to think about that as well. And to think about, one thing we're interested in doing is thinking about almost like ethnographic type studies of money, right? And how the cultural values around money translate into policy, and how making that more visible can enable us to kind of almost cherry pick some of those values and norms and put them into other issuances without having to adopt an unstable currency. So there are things like this, I think, are really going to be quite fruitful and interesting to explore.